One of the great accomplishments of modernity has been the establishment of societies in which people can live together with others whose ways of life are different than their own. Unfortunately, this achievement is currently threatened by rising forms of populism on the right and the left of the political and religious spectrums that are challenging the idea that peaceful coexistence across deep difference is a valuable social ideal. A growing chasm exists in the public deliberations of democracies around the world today, in which people of diverse religious and spiritual persuasions find it increasingly difficult to communicate across difference in order to live together in a common civil society. These differences are often tied to political, ideological, ethical orientations, moral proclivities, cultural identities, nationality, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and more. Conse- Consequently, extreme positions on the right and the left of the political and religious spectrums have come increasingly to dominate the public square, which challenges peaceful coexistence across difference. In this talk, I argue that the time has come to take the public square back from these extremes in diverse democratic societies by offering an alternative account of how we might live together in peaceful coexistence and a concomitant pedagogy to prepare youngsters to do so. After a brief review of the role of diversity in pre-modern social and political theory, I turn to the two revolutions of modernity that laid the foundation for contemporary thinking on the topic, and I argue that the most influential trends in education for religious and spiritual affiliation that emerged from these modern revolutions have contributed to this chasm. One follows the political liberalism and educational thought of American philosophers John Rawls and John Dewey, and the other cosmopolitan multiculturalism of German critical theorist Jürgen Habermas and of the Brazilian critical pedagogue Paulo Freire. I then consider an alternative to these accounts of the public square, which requires a recovery of what I call humanism, grounded in the diversity liberalism of Isaiah Berlin and the diversity theology of Jonathan Sachs and Emmanuel Levinas. The essay concludes with reference to some educational consequences of this analysis and draws on my own contribution to educational philosophy called Pedagogy of the Sacred and Pedagogy of Difference. During pre-modern times, Western politics was dominated by ancient Greek philosophy, according to which a virtuous society should serve a uniform vision of the good life. Plato proposed a hierarchical version of such a society, according to which each would receive resources and power according to his or her own perceived capacity to engage in a form of dialectical reasoning that would liberate from false beliefs and lead to a proper understanding of the idea of justice. Such a society should be governed by philosophers, not monarchs, oligarchs, or democratic citizens, who are capable of comprehending this idea and of implementing it in practice. By way of contrast, his pupil Aristotle thought that a virtuous society should serve its citizens, not the idea of justice, by enabling them to flourish. Although human flourishing may be fostered in different ways by distinct political communities that embody diverse cultural traditions, to do so, these communities must bring the underlying rationality of reality itself. Aristotle referred to this underlying rationality as God, who brought the university into being and whose comprehension and contemplation constitute the ultimate purpose of human existence. Within medieval scholastic philosophy, this proto-pluralistic outlook enabled the possibility of conversation across different communities, each organized around its respective religious tradition, provided that each tradition sought reconciliation between faith, as revealed in its sacred texts, and human reason, as conceived by pagan philosophy. To live in such a community, however, required adherence to a uniform account of what one should believe and how one should behave that was determined heteronomously by local religious and political authorities, not autonomously by the individual. This all changed with the two revolutions of modernity, Enlightenment and Emancipation. The Enlightenment was a 16th and 17th century intellectual movement that challenged transcendental assumptions of Platonic and Aristotelian rationalism by subjecting them to a rigorous form of empirical skepticism. This sort of skepticism tested all beliefs against an account of objective reality outside of human consciousness, uncomfortable with Plato's world of ideas and essences and Aristotle's teleology that begins and ends with the original cause. For example, In a doctrine known as empiricism, 16th century British philosopher John Locke maintained that people are not born with innate ideas, but that knowledge is determined by experience alone, derived from sense perception. In a state of nature, therefore, prior to experiencing the world, people are fundamentally equal and should be entitled to restrict one another's life, liberty, and property only following a mutually agreed upon social contract. With 17th century Scottish philosopher David Hume subjected the assumptions of this kind of skepticism to the same sort of doubts that empiricism used to challenge pre-modern rationalism, 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant responded. He proposed that understanding is only possible because of certain rational capacities with which human beings are endowed prior to ever experiencing the world, and that a just society should be governed by the equal and autonomous exercise of these very rational capacities by its citizens, not by higher authorities. These Enlightenment ideas gave rise to a series of political revolutions in the 18th and 19th century, known collectively as emancipation. They were mostly grounded in a liberal democratic account of justice that followed the political theories of Locke and Kant. According to this account, the right of autonomous citizens to choose ways of life for themselves, based on their own rational capacities, should take precedence over any conception of the good life that may be promoted by one group or another, whether based on religious faith, political ideology, ethical tradition, ethnic affiliation, or some other amalgamation of heteronymous ideals, attitudes, and customs. In this view, it is the obligation of any moral form of government to protect this fundamental right to choose a way of life. This value became known as liberal toleration, or in a word, pluralism. And it has been subjected to two sorts of criticism, one pertaining to Locke and the other to Kant. The difficulties with Locke's position is that an actual social contract would only commit those who gave their assent to the agreement in real time. You can only agree to a contract if you sign it. This is where an implied contract was thought to be relevant. One's consent to the original agreement could be inferred, it was thought, from one's willingness to enjoy the benefits that accrue from living in a society so founded. But this, of course, does not follow. The fact that one resides in a society and benefits from its organization does not imply that one would agree to the terms and conditions contained in its founding documents. Hence, the fact that one assents to them may be less voluntary than Locke supposed. The difficulty with Kant's position was noted by the 19th century German counter-enlightenment philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Contrary to Kant, Hegel held that reason is not the a priori lens through which people interpret the real world outside of consciousness. Rather, reason is acquired throughout history by way of a posteriori experience itself within the world outside of consciousness. Reason progresses, according to this view, by means of a dialectical process inspired by Plato, but inserted into history by Hegel. Each generation criticized the ideas of its immediate predecessors to liberate those ideas and their proponents from error until absolute freedom is achieved, first by a single nation or culture, and eventually by all of humanity. Protecting the right of autonomous individuals to choose their way of life by placing political authority in their hands may prove to be highly problematic, therefore. These individuals may not share a common account of reason, or their respective ways of reasoning may turn out to be flawed from one viewpoint or another. Extreme interpretations of this Hegelian view on both the right and the left of the political spectrum may well provide the basis for much of the populism that is challenging pluralism today. But this claim alone does not address the conceptual difficulty that arises from Hegel's critique of Kant. Rawls and Habermas are perhaps the most influential recent philosophers of diversity to address these difficulties with the liberal politics of Locke and Kant. However, the responses of Rawls and Habermas to Locke and Kant have also proven to be problematic. This is one of the main reasons, I contend, why the great pluralistic achievement of modernity is currently under assault. Rawls responded to difficulties with Locke's social contract by way of an agreement that would be accepted under certain hypothetical conditions. This is an ingenious idea. He called this the veil of ignorance. According to this idea, people would agree to two principles of justice were they to be aware of the proposition of were they to be unaware of the position they would hold in a society governed by them. The first of these is procedural justice. This principle would guarantee that the rules and institutions of society would be so constructed as to be administered fairly, without reference to irrelevant social, economic, gendered, ethnic, racial, or other considerations. The second of these is distributive justice. It would ensure that all things being equal, resources would be allocated so as to protect the interest of the weakest elements of society. However, when Rawls came to realize that these two principles can themselves be conceived as a comprehensive conception of the good, he proposed a more limited theory, what he called political liberalism. According to this alternative, accepting certain burdens of judgment would lead citizens to seek principles of justice compatible with every reasonable person's conception of the good. He called this public reason, which constitutes the basis of an overlapping consensus to direct the legitimate exercise of political power. Habermas, on the other hand, sought to revive a version of Kantian rationality by reconsidering certain left-leaning interpretations of Hegel. In contrast to Hegel's view that history progresses by way of dialectical conversation across the generations, Karl Marx held that the true engine of human progress entails overcoming current conflicts between those who possess economic resources and the means to produce them, and those who do not. Procedural justice cannot be guaranteed in this view unless economic resources are distributed equitably. Otherwise, those with more money, with greater capacity to make money, will always be able to exercise undue influence on the exercise of rules and regulations. To this claim, neo-Marxists such as Horkheimer and Adorno added that the pursuit of social progress must also be concerned with the non-discriminatory discourse, akin to Kantian rationality, only this time grounded in intersubjective agreement rather than in a priori conditions of individual cognition. The difficulty with Rawls' position lies in requiring citizens to embrace a particular understanding of pluralism, according to which people would be permitted to participate in public deliberation only by stating their belief in terms that could be acceptable to all. But this violates the boundaries of pluralism itself. Many beliefs, especially those associated with religious faith, cannot be formulated in terms of the sort of reasonableness without losing some of their very essence. To condition participation in civil discourse on embracing this formulation of reason, public reason, could well require leaving one's most cherished beliefs at the door. One of the reasons why the current candidate from the Republican Party in the United States for the Supreme Court is so controversial, because she brings to the table, whether one agrees with that view or not that agrees with her view, a religious interpretation of questions such as abortion that have to do with the famous decision of Roe versus Wade. The difficulty with Habermas's view lies in his assumption that a free intersubjective consensus is possible, which considers the total equalization of power to be a worthwhile end. But this may not be so. Those who do not believe in unqualified equality would inevitably be excluded from such a consensus and thus denied access to power. If people of this kind agree to such a consensus, in all likelihood, they would only do so perfunctorily because they would not want to be left without resources. Admission to the public domain in this view is predicated on accepting what some would consider to be a rather extreme account of distributive justice, whether or not one would otherwise want to do so. And this undermines diversity no less than Rawls' account of public reason. Perhaps the most influential educational theories associated with the American liberalism and the cosmopolitan multiculturalism can be found in the writings of John Dewey and Paulo Freire. Dewey argued that democratic education should prepare anonymous youngsters to solve problems encountered in experience by drawing on concepts and skills contained in the cultural heritage passed on from previous generations, if selected by their teachers. Freire, on the other hand, suggested what he called a critical pedagogy that poses problems to be addressed by groups of students who are encountered to call upon their particular backgrounds to contribute to a collective consensus. Although each of these educational theories offers a hope of individual and collective liberation from the bonds of past and current limitations, each restricts the possibility of such hope by homogenizing the many sorts of differences that need to be acknowledged, accepted, and engaged in order to achieve the sort of peaceful coexistence that could uh, lend meaning to such aspirations. The societies generated by these political and educational theories condition equitable treatment on leaving differences at the door of the public domain. Hence, many religious, cultural, and political worldviews often feel excluded from the public square in societies influenced by these views, because they are thought to be too divisive, distinctive, or dominating. I would suggest that this is one of the reasons for the rise of the various forms of political polarization and populism across the world today, on both the right and on the left, which has to do with the pushback against these versions of liberalism, both political and multicultural, by those who feel as though their voices have been excluded from the public square, which turns out to be less tolerant of diversity than they presuppose. Rather than promoting universal toleration of difference, this sort of exclusivism has tended to isolate intolerant and hateful voices on the fringes of diverse societies, with few opportunities for tempering dialogue with alternative or opposing views that can moderate extremes. When these voices do finally make their way into the public domain, they can sometimes be especially harsh and discordant, even violent. This is to explain, not justify, these sorts of bigotries and prejudices, at least in part, and to suggest the need for an alternative political theory on which to ground the celebration of diversity and accompanying pedagogies to prepare youngsters to live in a society envisaged by such a theory. A way out of the morass generated by the growing chasm among diverse religious, spiritual, cultural, and political views can be found in a renewed commitment to our common humanity, conceived in terms of the uniqueness, not conformity, of each individual person. I have called this a recovery of humanism and grounded my own commitment to such a recovery in the value pluralism of 20th century British philosopher Isaiah Berlin and in the theology of difference of the Hebrew Bible as read by Jewish philosophers Jonathan Sacks and Emmanuel Levinas. Berlin viewed human existence as comprised of multiple, distinct, and often incommensurable cultures and traditions, and the task of politics to discover a modus vivendi for peaceful coexistence across difference through dialogue. This political theory has sometimes been called diversity liberalism, as opposed to political or multiculturalism. According to Sachs, the distinctiveness of each person's experience of the world follows from the idea that people are created in the image of the divine. This means that each person is different, not the same, special, singular, in a word, holy, like God, the ultimate model of holiness. These unique persons call out to us, following Levinas, in all of their individuality, and each is obliged to respond by receiving the other in a non-reciprocal relation of responsibility with the words of the Hebrew prophets, Hineni, here I am, ready to serve. In contrast to Dewey and Ferrari, I have argued that the genuine hope for peaceful coexistence is to be sought in three educational consequences of this kind of diversity advocated by Berlin, Sachs, and Levinas. I call them pedagogy of the sacred, intelligent spirituality, and pedagogy of difference. Pedagogy of the
Hanan,
sacred, yeah?
Hanan, if I can give you 2 more minutes because of 20
I'll
minutes.
finish in 2 minutes, no problem. Pedagogy of the sacred entails initiation into a particular tradition or worldview to become an insider, so to say. But not just any perspective will suffice for living together in a diverse society. The particular way of life into which people should be initiated for this purpose must be prepared to dialogue alternative, even opposing orientations. I've called viewpoints that are prepared to engage alternatives in this way intelligent spiritualities. Engaging alternatives involves teaching and learning about or from them, as an outsider, as it were, by phenomenology, sociology, history, politics, philosophy, theology, or some other relevant academic discipline, or to consider insights that they may have to offer to non-believers. Pedagogy of the sacred is concerned with initiation into a worldview that can come that can form the basis of one's primary identity, while at the same time imparting the values and capacities needed to engage alternative perspectives in dialogue. However, how is it possible to challenge sacred perspectives of this kind, which are grounded in particular traditions, given that there is no objective or intersubjective view upon which to base this sort of inquiry? This is where pedagogy of the different comes into play, which involves instruction from or about worldviews other than one's own. It presupposes that an education worthy of the name must not only initiate into a concept of the sacred according to one tradition or another, but also offer exposure to alternative perspectives. One point of such engagement is this. One point of such engagement is the same in both faith-based and common schools. The one serving a singular religious community, the other a community of the communities that encompasses multiple approaches, belief and unbelief. It is to empower students with an inquisitive attitude toward the worldviews to which they are heir or with which they choose to affiliate, and to promote respect for perspectives deeply different than their own. Taking back the public square requires the recovery of humanism that is grounded in fundamental diversity, not uniformity of human experience, and a concomitant innovative pedagogy that prepares students to embrace the ways in which they are different from others and to engage and respect the ways others may be different from them. Teaching this concept of humanity requires cultivating a robust sense of self, rooted in a tradition that is at once capable of inspiring such a sense of obligation toward others, yet also able to engage others whose sources of inspiration and obligation may be different from one's own. Herein lies the possibility of genuine hope for recovery from our current morass.